Today's daf we're going to be learning is Chullin daf Peidalet. It's the daf for Tisha B'Av. It's generally customary not to learn on Tisha B'Av, which is why I'm posting it early, so if people want to get ahead, you can. Okay. We saw the Mishnah about Kisoy Adam, covering the blood, and when it's relevant, when it's not, right? Undomesticated animals and birds, not for domesticated animals. For Chullin, non-sacred items, but not for Kodshim. To which the Gemara said, what do you mean, not for Kodshim? But Kodshim is Mizbeach, right? We're talking about birds, not animals, because, the Chayot don't go on the altar, and Behemot, you're not obligated for Kisoy Adam, but when it's a bird, after you put the blood on the side of the altar, you can then take it off, scrape it off, and cover it. So why, right? So you actually are obligated. To which the Gemara assume we're talking about for temple maintenance. Okay, if you have birds that you sanctify for temple maintenance, and then you slaughter them, which you're not allowed to because you're not allowed to benefit from them, so basically they're forbidden to benefit, which means that your shechita is an invalid shechita. If it's an invalid shechita, then we're going to say, invalid shechita isn't shechita, and therefore you're not obligating Kisoy Adam. Kisoy Adam, covering the blood, is only when you do a valid shechita. To which the Gemara asks, top of our daf, wait a minute. Why don't we turn that invalid shechita into a valid shechita, even though we already slaughtered it and theoretically we weren't supposed to? But now you can actually redeem it. Move the sanctity onto something else. Take the bird, and then the bird can actually be eaten. Once it's permitted to eat, well, then you have to, go back and say, now I have to cover the blood. So they say, no, there's a different reason, which is be'inan hamada b'haracha. In order to redeem something, you have to stand it up and evaluate it. And if the animal can't stand because the animal's dead, well, then it can't be redeemed. So we've neutralized this question of redeem it, and then it should be valid. So now we go back to saying that's why kodshe beda kabayit, a bird that you sanctify for temple maintenance, is, right, it's a bad shechita because it's a bad shechita, and it can't be redeemed. That's why you don't have to do the blood. Now they say ukemam, but wait a minute. If you say you have to do hamada v'aracha, that's actually a debate. And we're going to see that also whether shechita that's not a valid shechita is considered shechita or not is also a debate. And we're going to see how they go together. So they say ukeman. The fact that you need hamada v'aracha and can't redeem it would only fit according to Rabbi Meir. Now, Ika Rabbi Meir da'amar kol yu b'chlal hamada v'aracha. Now, this debate about hamada v'aracha, whether you have to stand up this item to evaluate it, is a machloket whether it's only in items that go on the altar, or even items that are sanctified for beda kabayit, for the temple maintenance. So Rabbi Meir holds everything needs it, also beda kabayit, which would then fit perfectly with our sugya, and that would explain why it can't be redeemed. But the problem is, if you're going with Rabbi Meir's approach on shechita she'ena ru'uya, invalid shechita, is different than what we said. Ha'amal, doesn't he himself say shechita she'ena ru'uya shema shechita? An invalid shechita is still called a shechita, which means you would have to do Kisoy Adam. So you won't have to do Kisoy Adam because you can redeem it, but you would have to do Kisoy Adam from the beginning because it's actually a valid shechita. So anytime you slaughter a bird that was dedicated for temple maintenance, so what that you're not allowed to slaughter it, you still have to do Kisoy Adam. So it can't be that. Now, Ika Rabbi Shimon, Da'amar, now if we go with Rabbi Shimon, who says shechita she'ena ru'uya lo shema shechita, which is what we said in the beginning, an invalid shechita is not a shechita, in which case you don't have to do the blood. However, you have to cover the blood. However, what's the problem? Rabbi Shimon himself says in the hamada v'aracha, he says lo yu b'chlal hamada v'aracha. He says that things that are for temple maintenance don't need to be stood up to be redeemed, meaning you can redeem it. If you can redeem it, then retroactively you can actually, right, and as at this point you can actually eat it, which means that we go back and say you have to do Kisoy Adam on that. And we're trying to find a case where you don't do Kisoy Adam. So now it's really confusing. How do we resolve this? Very easily. Amar Rav Yosef, Rebbe, V'nasa b'la liba d'tanai. The first answer is Rav Yosef. He says it all fits into the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, who organized the Mishnah. In other words, we're basically calling it Rebbe because he's the one who put together the Mishnah. And he held in different issues like different Tanaim, meaning, B'shchita she'ena ru'uya savar laka Rabbi Shimon. B'hamada v'aracha savar laka Rabbi Meir. He held like Rabbi Shimon that shchita she'ena ru'uya isn't shchita. That's why you're not chayiv in Kisoy Adam. And if you want to say redeem it, well, he holds like Rabbi Meir that you can't redeem it unless you can stand it up. And you can't stand it up, so it can't be redeemed. Okay, that's answer number one. Answer number two, Ibait ema kula Rabbi Shimon hi. It actually is Rabbi Shimon, which will lead us to say that shchita she'ena ru'uya, you don't have to do Kisoy Adam. You can redeem it, Okay, but what? Even if you can redeem it, you still don't have to do kisur adam. Why is that? Because shanei hachadam akrav v'shafach v'kisa. There's still no obligation of kisur adam, even if I redeem it. Why is that? Because it says slaughter the animal, then spill the blood. You spill the blood, and then you cover it. Mi she'eino mechusar ela shvicha v'kisui. Has to be when you slaughter the animal, all you have to do is spill the blood and cover it. Here you're going to spill the blood, you're going to redeem the animal, and then cover it. So there's another stage. Because of that, you're not obligated, because the Torah only obligated you when you can do the kisoy immediately after shvicha, and you're not missing any other action to get to that obligation. Here, you won't be obligated unless you do that action. It's not part of the obligation. To which the Gemara now goes all the way back to the end of yesterday's daf, which is, now that you say that, we can actually figure out that we can read the Mishnah. Okay, there's a new way of reading the Mishnah, that Mukudashim actually includes Kodshei Mizbeach. How so? Because what did we say? Afilu tema Kodshei Mizbeach. You can even put that into the Mishnah now. Misha eno mechusar ela shvicha v'kisui. Yatzah zeh shemechusar shvicha grira v'kisui. Remember, you had to scrape it off the altar in order to sprinkle the blood. That's missing another stage. And then we could say, even Kodshei Mizbeach, right? Birds you do malika on the altar, you don't have to sprinkle the blood. You don't have to cover the blood because it's missing another action. And now we reread the Mishnah as Mukdashim isn't just Bedek Habayit, which was one track we had. Now we can say it's Bedek Habayit or Kodshei Mizbeach. Mar Bar V'Ashi Amar, he's going to give a different reason why Mukdashim are exempt, and this would apply to all Mukdashim. Amar Kra Chaya O'of, because it says undomesticated animals or birds. Ma chaya ena kodesh, af of eno kodesh. Just like a chaya, it can never be put on the altar. Also, it has to be a bird that's eno kodesh, that's not sanctified, just like the chayot are not sanctified, because there are no korbanot with chayot. Ima, so then they say, wait a minute. Ima chaya she'en b'mina kodesh. So then maybe we could take it farther and say, listen, no type of chaya can ever be kodesh. And therefore, we could say like this. Af of, when it comes to the birds, the ones that you have to cover the blood, would be only ones she'ein b'mino kodesh, that don't have a parallel, right, that don't have of their type that could go on the altar. So maybe otzi torim u'bnei yonah sheyesh b'minan kodesh. Okay, the torim and the bnei yonah, which are the type of birds, right, the pigeons and the turtle doves that you use on the altar, maybe if you'd slaughter them outside the temple, you wouldn't have to sprinkle the blood because they're parallel, right? They actually have a parallel that goes on the altar, whereas the chayot have none. To which they answer, lo, kechaya. No. We're going to actually compare the birds to a chaya in a different way. Ma chaya lo chalakta ba af of lo tachlok bo. Just like in a chaya, we make no distinctions and we say all chayot, right? We say all afot. And we don't say, there's some birds because they go on the altar, so you don't actually have to cover the blood. Okay? We don't say that. Now we're going to have another question about this chaya issue. So Amar le Yaakov mina ala Rava. So we have a heretic, who questions Rava. They're always going to be kind of, questions that are trying to jab at the rabbis. When it comes to kosher animals, right, we know there's chewing its cud and split hooves. Now, it says there, behema. These are the signs of the behema for kosher animals. And there the word animals includes domesticated and non-domesticated animals. So why don't we say when it says chaya, in our case, in covering the blood, maybe it includes animals as well. Amar le. So what does Rava say to this heretic? Alecha amar kra. For you, the pasuk says, meaning to respond to someone like you, the pasuk says, when it comes to slaughtering meat and animals, it's talking about there, ala aretz yishbachenu kemayim. Now it says, right, there it's talking about not eating the blood when you slaughter animals, and they mean behemot, right, domesticated animals, and it says spill the blood on the ground like water. What does this teach you? Ma mayim lo ba'iki. So just like water doesn't need to be covered, af hainami lo ba'iki. So this blood doesn't need to be covered either. So there's a special pasuk that says, no, you don't need to do this for animals. So that's why you can know that chaya doesn't include animals, domesticated ones. So elameata. So now comes a question, which looks like, and in the commentaries I saw, like in the Schottenstein, for example, they say this is the Gemara asking the question. The Koren, they say this is the Gemara asking the question. But to me, it seems possible it's the heretic asking, because it sounds like a bit of a heretical question. So the Gemara asks, or the heretic continues and asks, and says, elameata yet bilubo. If you're going to view that pasuk as blood is like water, that you don't have to cover it, why don't we say blood is like water and you can use it for a mikvah? Okay, that's why it seems like a bit of a heretical question. Who would ever want to go in a mikvah full of blood? But if you really view blood like water, you should be able to go in the mikvah. To which they answer, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Ach ma'ayanu bor mikveh mayim yetahor. Okay, it's talking about mikvah waters, and it calls it a stream or a bore or a pit. A mikveh mayim will be tahor. So now they say, Hani'im midachrini lo. It seems to say these are the types of things you could use for a mikveh, and they're all water. Wait, maybe that's just coming to exclude other liquids that are not water, or, right, but anything that's called water, like blood, which is compared to water, why don't we say maybe that is included? So they say no, because because it says ma'ayan mayim, and it also says bor mayim. Now, I want to point out, it doesn't say mayim more than once in that pasuk, but it says ach ma'ayan ubor mikveh mayim. Okay, soon we'll get to the word mikveh, but right now, ma'ayan and bor, that's two words, and they both go with the word water. So because it says it twice, it comes to exclude other liquids, and it comes to exclude blood. Now they say no, because Ema, here's the counter argument. Maybe they're both coming to exclude other liquids. One is to talk about if other liquids are streaming. And one is if they're in their stationary waters, in a jug, in a barrel. Okay? Now, so we're back to saying maybe it's not excluding blood, to which they answer, there's three miyutim, which are ma'ayan mayim, ubor mayim, mikveh mayim. Okay, because there's three of them, therefore we can exclude also other mashkim, zochalim or mechunasim, and also blood. Okay, and that's why our mikvahs aren't made of blood. Thank God. Okay, Tanu Rabanan. Now we're going to darshan more of the words in the pasuk. So it said there, Asher Yatsud, that you hunt. Now it says Asher Yatsud said. Okay, so ish min b'nei Israel, Asher Yatsud, that will hunt. Said, the hunt of, in other words, it's a noun. First the verb, then the noun. We're going to see why is that repeat. If you say Asher Yatsud, will hunt, obviously you're hunting things that are hunted. Okay? And then it says anyway, Chaya o Of. So why does it say Asher Yatsud, said? So let's figure out. Asher Yatsud, en liyada Asher Yatsud. Nitzodim v'omdim alehem minayin. It's only if you go hunt. What if you didn't go hunting, but, kigon, avazim v'tarnagolim. You have in your pen, roosters, and or your chicken coop, you have chickens and all that, and you don't go hunting them. So, Talmud Lamar said, Mikol Makom. The word said comes to include any kind of thing that is in, even if you didn't hunt it. In Kema Talmud Lamar Asher Yatsud. So why does it say Asher Yatsud? Linda Torah Derech Eretz. The Torah teaches you, and from here we're going to get off on a whole tangent of how best to behave, how best to eat, we'll talk about this. You should only eat meat behazmana hazot, you should limit your quantity of eating meat. Okay? And it shouldn't be things that are so easy for you to get. Okay? But something that Asher Yatsud, which is not so easy. You have to go hunting. So don't do it all the time. Okay, we're going to see. This concern seems to be that people couldn't afford to eat meat all the time. And they're trying to teach the people, listen, moderate your eating habits and that are so that they work out with your financial means. Okay, so now we're going to see a whole sugya about this. Tanu Rabbanan, another braita that relates to this. Ki yarchiv Hashem Elokecha et gvulcha. Okay, there it says when God gives you more land when you get into the land, and then it says v'zavachta mi b'karcha u'mitzoncha asher. Sorry, that's not the pasuk. I read the wrong pasuk. In Dvarim Yud Bet pasuk Kaf. And you say, I want to eat meat because you're desiring meat. So now what are they going to darshan from this? You should only eat meat when you're hungry for it. Okay? Not when just I'm in the mood to eat stam, for no real reason. Now you might have thought, okay, so go to the shuk and buy meat. You should take from your own. That pasuk says. When you want to take, this is the next pasuk, okay, that I started reading by accident before. It says, when you're far from the temple and you don't want to bring sacrifices all the time to be able to eat meat, so what are you going to do? You're going to slaughter from your animals. So it's saying basically, try to have your own animals so that you don't have to go buying animals in the shuk all the time. Okay, buying meat, it's expensive. You might have thought you can slaughter all the animals you have then. Talmud Lomar, again, an inference from the pasuk. Mi bekarcha v'lo kol bekarcha, from your cattle. Mi tzoncha v'lo kol tzoncha, from your sheep. Okay, not all your sheep. Mi always means from, not all of them. In other words, you need your animals to work. You need your sheep for wool, for also the females for the milk. Okay, don't slaughter them all, because then you're going to not have what you need in your house. Mikan amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. From here, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who by the way was wealthy, but I guess understood the people who weren't, and he gives advice, and he says the following. Misha yesh lo maneh, if you have 100 zuzim, which is not a lot, I mean, it's not a small amount, but it's not a lot, yikach lo maneh, yikach lit paso, will take for his pot, litra yerak. Okay, get vegetables, make a vegetable soup. Maneh, asara maneh, if you have 10 times that amount, yikach, remember, maneh is 100 zuzim, so you have 10 times that amount, yikach le paso litra dagim. You can take the same amount, but of fish. 50 maneh, if you have 50 times the amount, right, of a maneh, yikach lepaso litra basar. Then you can go by meat. 100 maneh yishpetu lo k'dera b'chol makom. Okay, 100 maneh, you can have a full pot every day. Now notice that different ones related to different items you could have in it. The last one related to how often. It says every day. So now they say v'inach emat. So what about all the others? How often can you eat? Me'erev Shabbat le'erev Shabbat. When we say you could buy fish or you could buy meat, only buy it once a week for Shabbat. Okay, don't buy it more than that because you're not going to be able to afford it. Amar Rav, tzrichim anu lachush l'divrei zaken. So Rav said, we really have to worry about what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said. Amar Rabbi Yochanan responds to Rav's statement and says, Abba, which is Rav, mi mishpacha bri'im havi. He was from a family of very healthy, strong people. They didn't need meat all the time. Okay, now we get to, vegetarians who have to be, or vegans who have to be checking, do they get all the nutrients? He says, "Aval kigon anu," but us, we're weak. Misheyesh lo pruta b'toch kiso. If you have money for it, that day you ritzena lechavani, go take it right away to the chavani. Buy yourself some meat and eat it, because when you get money, you have to eat meat. It's not healthy for you not to. So we're balancing two things here: the finances and the health issues. Amar Rav Nachman kigon anu. Rav Nachman says, like us, where we both are weaker and we don't have enough money. Lovin va'ochlin. We borrow money in order to be able to afford to eat, because it's important to eat. Kvasim levushcha. Now we're going to darshan these two psukim in Mishlei, chapter 27, verses 26-27. Kvasim levushcha. Okay, sheep for your clothing. Umechir sadeh atudim. And the price for your field should be to buy atudim, which are also from the sheep family. V'dei chalev izim lelachmech. Okay, so and enough milk from your goats. Lelachmecha lelechem beitecha, for your bread and for the bread of your family. V'chayim lenarotecha, and to bring life to your young ones. Okay, we're going to darshan all these parts. Kvasim lelevushecha miges kvasim yehem avushcha. Okay, from the wool of your sheep, you should get your clothing from. Okay, mechir sadeh atudim la'olam yimkor adam sadeh v'yikach atudim. Better to sell your field and buy the sheep. V'al yimkor adam atudim v'yikach sadeh, not the reverse. Because the sheep provide milk and provide clothing, and therefore we'd rather have that, and ultimately meat as well. Okay, better to make, right, to have your sustenance come from your own stuff, from your milk that's in your house. It's a little bit weird. Okay, I translate it kind of as if there was a vav in between end. It doesn't really say that. So they say, for your bread, the bread of your family. How do we read that? This is the airplane thing. Put on your oxygen mask first. First feed yourself, then feed your family. Okay, we'll see something that seems to say a little differently later, but right now, feed yourself first, then your family. Give life to your young ones. What does that mean? Don't get your children used to eating meat and wine all the time, because then they won't be able to afford their life when they get older. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, turning now to Amud Bet. Rabbi Yochanan says, this is continuing the same idea. If you want to get wealthy, you should have a lot of small animals, because they end up helping to get your wealth, because you can make clothes out of it, you can have milk from it, okay? They produce their things that are important to you. Okay, Tosfot says, it talks about in Psachim, in the chapter about a minhag hamakom, if you deal with beimot dakot, you won't see a siman bracha l'olam, and there's all these issues that graze in other people's fields. So Rabbeinu Tam says that's when you're doing it in the city, where they're going to destroy other people's stuff, or they say also because of ayin hara, Tosfot says, but this is talking about out, when you're shepherding far away. By the way, this whole thing about better to have your flock than land, that's totally the shepherd mentality rather than the landowner's mentality, right? We all know owning land is also a good thing. I didn't mention, but land produces food as well, but it's a lot of work, both to plant, right? And then you need workers to help you bring in the produce. It's an expensive proposition, even if it's going to yield good results. And also it all depends on the weather. If there's bad results, bad weather, you're not going to have good crops that year. So it's definitely much more risky. Amar Rav Chisda, my dechtiv ashterot zonecha, another pasuk, this is from Dvarim chapter 7. Shema'ashrot et ba'alehem. Okay, that tzon makes their owners wealthy, as we've been saying. V'amar Rabbi Yochanan, kasa decharshim v'lo kasa deposhim. Okay, this is apropos healthy or not healthy things. Better to drink a cup from a witch rather than, or from a one of these people doing all sorts of sorcery, rather than a cup of tepid water. That's where the bacteria grows. Okay, you'll see things that, reflect if you go to a third world country, right? You have to boil the water. We're going to see that here. We're going to have all sorts of limitations, though. Tepid water is a problem if it's in a klei matechet, a metal vessel. If it's an earthenware vessel, late lamba, there's no problem. Also, the klei matechet is only a problem el delo shadibut sivya. If you didn't put any spices in, okay, or like tea leaves. Aval shadibut sivya late lamba. If you put in some leaves, it already takes out the bacteria. It kind of counters it. V'chilo shadibut sivya nami lo amaran. If you didn't put those in, it's still not a problem. Ela delot sai. It's only if you didn't boil it. Aval, I said we get to boiling. Aval sai, it's late lamba, but if you boiled it, there's no problem. V'amar Rabbi Yochanan. Mishinech lo aviv ma'ot v'rotze la'abdan. If your father left you a lot of money and you want to just do it, throw it all away. Okay, this is basically saying, don't do what I'm about to tell you. You'll bash klei pishtan, you'll wear linen garments, v'yishtamesh b'klei zchulchit, and you'll use glass vessels, v'yiskor po'alim v'al yeshev imahen, and you'll hire workers, but you won't watch over them. Okay, what does this mean? You'll bash klei pishtan b'kitana romiyata. We're talking about specific material, this cotton from the Romans, or whatever we call it in English, which is very fine, very expensive, but rips very easily. This is white glass, which breaks very easily. It's, again, very expensive, but breaks very, very easily and can't be fixed. So what is that? What kind of work that you really have to watch your workers? You don't always have to watch them. But b'torei denafish p'sidayu. First of all, you should probably always watch your workers, right? If you ever did construction in your house and you're not watching what they're doing all the time, right? They might do the wrong things. They might cut corners. They might do all sorts of things that, would mess it up. And likewise, if you're, you have people working for you, we all know if you're not on top of people and following up, things fall between the cracks. But what they're talking about here, what the Gemara explains is b'torei, with oxen, denafish p'sidayu. They can cause a lot of damage. If someone's not watching them, they let the oxen roam free. They trample in the fields. While trampling in the fields, they could get stuff stuck on their bodies and, kind of damage them. They could trip, right, on the vines, let's say, and all sorts of things could happen, and they're not going to end up doing as much work as they're supposed to be doing by plowing in the fields. So that's one of the things where there's a big, where you could really lose a lot of money very easily. Darish Rav Avira. Zimnin Amar Lamishmei Rabbi Ami, Zimnin Amar Lamishmei Rabbi Asi. Okay, sometimes you quote in the name of Rabbi Ami, sometimes in the name of Rabbi Asi, but Rav Avira says the following: My dechtiv tov ish chonenu malveh yichalkel dvarav b'mishpat. Another pasuk. This is a pasuk from Tilin. Okay, good is a person who is chonen umalveh. He has pity on people and loans. Yichalkel dvarav b'mishpat. This is the part that's important to us. He manages his stuff with judiciousness. What does that mean? You should always eat and drink less than what your means are. If you have means for more, always cut down. But buy clothes, though, according to your means. But give your wife and your children more beyond your means. Okay, lots of people do this, right? They, for their kids especially, right? They or for their spouses, right? They'll spend more money than they want. Okay, so for yourself, this is a little different than before. Eat your own bread and then give them, but that was for basic. This is for more. So you should give them more than even what you have. Shehem tluyim bo, because they're dependent on you. But hu taloi b'misha amar v'haya ha'olam. But you're dependent on God. So you can rely on the fact that God will protect you, but your children need to rely on you, and therefore you should, and your wife, and therefore you should give them more than what you can afford. Okay, which obviously not too much more. Okay. Darish Rav Eina. Now we're moving back to another issue. Okay, so we're done with all the tangent of all the derech eretz and how to live and how to manage your money. For the most part, we were talking about. Darish Rav Eina apitcha de Reish Galuta. So Rav Eina now made a drasha in the entrance of the Reish Galuta's house, and this we're going to see. He in the end they're going to reject what he says. Hashochet lechole b'Shabbat chayav lechasot. If you slaughter for a sick person on Shabbat, you have to cover the blood. And it sounds like on Shabbat. So Amar lehu Rabba eshtima kamar. Wow, this is a very surprising matter. He just said lishmetu le'amorei minei, take away his amora. The amora was the person who kind of was the loudspeaker that got the rabbi's words to the community. Don't give him one because I don't want him spouting this nonsense. This isn't true, and I don't want people to think it's okay. Tanya, how do we know it's not true? Because of this Tosefta. Rabbi Yossi Omer, there's going to be one sentence in this Tosefta that's going to be relevant. Koi en shochatinu oto b'yom tov. This we saw in the Mishnah. Koi is a safek behema safek chaya, so they're not necessarily chayiv in kisoy adam. And therefore, don't slaughter it on Yom Tov, because then you might have to cover the blood, but if it's not really obligated, then you can't do it on Yom Tov. V'im shachato em mechasin et amo. Now, if you did it anyway, you won't be able to cover the blood. Okay, this we saw in the Mishnah. Now he's going to explain, mi kava chomer. How do I know that you don't cover the blood? It's a kava chomer. How does it work? Uma mila, brit mila, shevada'a. If it's a definite brit mila, like baby's born on Shabbat, you do the brit mila on Shabbat. So vada'a doche Shabbat. And yet, ein sveka doche Yom Tov. Now Yom Tov is obviously less than Shabbat, right? Less stringent. And yet a brit milah that's a safek will not override Yom Tov, because right, if the kid was born and they're not sure it's bein hashmashot, whether it was a week before Yom Tov, right, the day before or the day after, we don't know which day it happened. So we don't do the brit milah 8 days later. We push it off till after Yom Tov. Okay, like if it happens if we take a Shabbat example, happens Friday night in between sunset and the end of sunset. So the baby, we can't do it on Friday because that's not 8 days. We can't do it on Shabbat, right? Because, sorry, I didn't say that right. If it was born on Shabbat, which we don't know, if it was born Friday and Shabbat, then Friday will be only the 7th day. If you want to then do it on Shabbat, because that's definitely the 8th day at least, right? If not the 9th day. But what's the problem? The problem is that we don't override it, because we don't know. Only when it's definitely the 8th day do we let you do it on Shabbat. And same thing on Yom Tov. Okay, so now, he says, if a Brit Milah, the Vadai overrides Shabbat, but a Safek doesn't, then Kisoy Hadam she'ein vada'o doche Shabbat, when you're definitely obligating Kisoy Hadam, which we're going to assume is our case, where you slaughtered for a sick person on Shabbat, because we're talking about a sick person who, needs the food, and therefore you're allowed to slaughter if you didn't have any meat, and yet you're not allowed to cover the blood, which is against what Rav Eina said. Anyway, since that's definite, Eino din she'ein sveko doche Yom Tov, wouldn't you then assume that a koi for sure wouldn't override Yom Tov if it's Vadai doesn't override Shabbat? Okay, now, Amrulo. So now here's a reaction. We don't really need this for our purposes, but we're here on the Tosefta anyway. So now we have two reactions to this Kal Chomer. They reject it. Amrulo. So even though they reject it, still his point about what he makes, the Kal Chomer might not work, but he does make a point that Kisoy Adam, the Vadai, is not Doche Shabbat, and we'll come back to that when we finish the Tosefta. Amrulo. Tkiyat shofar b'gvulin tochiach. Okay, tkiyat shofar outside of the temple. In the temple, they would blow the shofar even when Rosh Hashanah came out on Shabbat. But tkiyat shofar b'gvulin outside the temple, they wouldn't blow the shofar on Shabbat. Now, this will prove that your Kal Chomer is all wrong. Why? She'en vada'a doche Shabbat. Now, when it's vadai, it doesn't override Shabbat. However, even sveka, even if you're in doubt about whether you're obligated to tkiyat shofar or not, which later we're going to have to figure out what that means, doche Yom Tov. But you can even do that on Yom Tov, because you always blow the shofar on Yom Tov, right? And even if it's safek, you blow it on Yom Tov, because Rosh Hashanah is Yom Tov. Okay, so here you see that something might not be allowed on Shabbat, and yet in a Vadai case, in a definitive case, and a Sefek case, actually you would do it on Yom Tov. So you can't make that comparison to Brit Milah, because Tkiyat Shofar is different, and maybe we learn from Tkiyat Shofar, and then we'd say, you can Sefek Yom Tov, you can actually do Kisoy Hadam. Heshiv Rabbi Elazar Kapar Beribi Tshuva. He brings another issue with this Kavachomer. Ma Lemilah Shekain Ena Nohega B'Leilei Yamim Tovim. Why are we learning this from Brit Milah? Brit Milah is very different from Kisoy Adam, because Brit Milah is not on Leil Yom Tov. Okay, you don't do it on Leil Yom Tov. Now Kisoy Adam, when it's a Vadai case, on Yom Tov, if you slaughter on Yom Tov and you did it at night, you would have to cover the blood. So Brit Milah is already limited more, and maybe that's why we limit it and say the suffix doesn't override Yom Tov. But it seems a little unrelated, but what they're saying is, since Kisoy Adam can happen even at night, Tomar Kisoy Adam, Shanoheg B'Leilei Yamim Tovim, since you could do it even at night, maybe it's more expansive, and maybe then you could do it, it's suffix on Yom Tov. And that would go against the Koi thing, right? So now, okay. So now we're going to say the following. Again, that was against Rabbi Yossi, who said, a Koi, you don't slaughter on Yom Tov, and if you do, you don't cover the blood, and they tried to say your Kavachomer doesn't really work. So Amar Rabbi Abba, we have one last point before we get back to our main idea here. Amar Rabbi Abba, okay, these are one of the things that Rabbi Chia said, I don't have anything to counter against this Kavachomer that Rabbi Yossi made, even though we just saw two, but Rabbi Chia himself didn't see any difficulty. Ve'eshiv Rabbi Elazar Kapar Beribi Tshuva, but Beribi, sorry. But Rabbi Elazar Kapar Beribi, he had a retort to it. Okay, that's just a side point. Now we go back to the main point. Katani miyad. However, in this Braita, what does it say? One of the lines of Rabbi Yossi was Kisoy she'en vada'o doche Shabbat. Now, my vada'o de kisoy de lo doche Shabbat. What's the case of vada'o bekisoy that doesn't override Shabbat? A definitive case where you still wouldn't do it on Shabbat. Is it not lava shochet l'chole b'Shabbat? Is it not slaughtering for a sick person on Shabbat? So they say no, because dilma da'avar v'shachat. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's a person who went against the law, transgressed Shabbat, slaughtered when they weren't allowed to, and maybe that's the case. But they say, no, it can't be, because they're comparing it to a Brit Milah in the comparison, right? That's the Kavachomer. And Dumia de Milah, it has to be like Brit Milah. Now, Ma Milah b'Reshut, Af Kisor Nam b'Reshut. Now, since Brit Milah was done with Reshut, you're allowed to do it. This must be a case where you're allowed to slaughter, and that's what we're talking about, and therefore it must be our case, in which case we knock out what Rav Eina said, or at least Rabbah brings this difficulty from this Tosefta, which there's no answer to. Now the Gemara says, let's just go back to some of the words in this Braita, and we want to understand what this case of Safek Tkiyat Shofar is. And we won't figure this out today. I'll leave you hanging. Amrulo, Tkiyat Shofar b'gvulin tochiach she'en vada'o doche Shabbat u'sfecha doche Yom Tov. So now we just go back to that line. Tkiyat Shofar outside of the temple will prove, because in a Vadai case, it doesn't override Shabbat, but yet in a Safek, in a case of doubt, it overrides Yom Tov. Now, my Sfecha, what kind of Safek are we talking about? Ilema Safek calls Safek Yom Tov, if it's because, we don't know what day Rosh Hashanah really is. So every day of Rosh Hashanah, right, maybe it's a regular day of the week, maybe it's Yom Tov. Now, if that's the Safek, that makes no sense to say, that's certainly obvious that you're going to be able to blow shofar, because Hashta Vada Yom Tov Dachya, Safek Yom Tov, Safek Chomer Baya. If when it's definitely Rosh Hashanah, we allow you, even though it's Rosh Hashanah and a holiday, a Yom Tov, we allow you. Of course, if it's maybe Rosh Hashanah, but maybe it's even a regular day of the week, of course we're going to allow you, because what's the worst case? It's a regular day of the week? Well, of course you could blow shofar on a regular day of the week. I could blow shofar whenever I want. So that can't be it. So let's wait and see till tomorrow. In tomorrow's daf, what the suffix really is here, that we're saying, even in that suffix case, you're allowed to blow shofar on Yom Tov. Okay, so what did we do today? We tried to figure out the Mukdashim in the Mishnah, which we had different ways of understanding. It could be the Mukdashim, which are Bedek Habayit only, or maybe it's even Mukdashim that are Kodesh Mizbeach. We have ways to explain it, that you're not obligating Kisoy Hadam. Okay, the Kodesh Mizbeach went in both ways, depending on, our explanation. Then we did some drashot on the Chaya, specifically the Chaya, not a Be'emah, right? And why not? Why doesn't Chaya include Be'emah, just like Be'emah includes Chaya? We had the heretics question. We also said, right, it shows that Be'emot, right, the oaf, right, we tried to say the Chaya oaf, just like it's not Kodesh, the oaf is also not Kodesh, and maybe then, maybe we'd exclude Torim and Bnei Yonah, but we got rid of that. We rejected that. Then we had the whole Asher Yatsud, and from there we got to that You have to plan your meat, right? And don't just eat all the time meat because it's not good for your financial security. And then we had all sorts of advice about financial security. One of the main ones being have small animals. They're very good and they're easy to take care of and they produce a lot of things that are good for you. Then we got to the Shochet l'choleh b'Shabbat. That really took us to the last sugya. Shochet l'choleh b'Shabbat. According to Rav Eina, you have to cover the blood on Shabbat. But Rabbah said no way, no how, and brought the Tosefta to contradict, where it was very clear from the Tosefta that it does not override Shabbat. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day, and having a fast, it may be a good and meaningful fast.